There are certain individuals that everybody seems to know by name and know what they've done on the world stage to garner their public popularity or influence. Names like Charles Darwin or Anne Frank, Thomas Edison or Harriet Beecher Stowe. Some people are so well known they only need one name to recognize them: Oprah, Einstein, Plato, Cleopatra. But right now, I don't want to talk about them. I'm a little more interested in the people who have had broad impact on our everyday lives, but we have no idea who they really are. For example, have you ever heard of Niels Bohlin? I didn't think so. But he did something that has literally saved countless lives and impacts our life almost daily. He invented the 3-point seatbelt. There are many more people just like him who have had huge impact on society, but they lack public notoriety. One person you should likely add to that list if you're a Latter-day Saint is the name Joseph F. Merrill. Literally, he is influencing your life right now. Since this podcast is being produced by Religious Education at Brigham Young University, as the Commissioner of Church Education, Joseph Merrill was the one who helped save BYU from being closed by the church and transferred over to state ownership. He saw the benefit for the church to have a university. He also played a major role in developing the seminary and institute system for the church, which I came through and taught for many years before coming to BYU. As I say these words, maybe I should have named one of my own sons Merrill. He has influenced my life so directly. Professor Casey Griffiths has recently published a defining biography on Joseph Merrill called Truth Seeker: The Life of Joseph F. Merrill, Scientist, Educator, and Apostle.
And Elder Merrill, it's safe to say, hasn't to this point been a well-known figure in the church. And so nobody had really researched it, but what I found in those documents was just a really fascinating story that covered a time period that I was particularly interested in.
In this episode, Casey Griffiths takes us, or should I say introduces many of us, to this relatively unknown but influential figure in the church, and the fascinating story his life exemplifies about seeking truth that is still relevant to us today. I'm your host, Professor Anthony Sweat, and this is Why Religion.
Each year, religion professors at Brigham Young University produce hundreds of publications on subjects related to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. This podcast brings this research into one place to enlighten the everyday seeker of truth.
Seek learning, even by study and also by faith.
Interviewing the author, we discuss why the study was done, why it matters, and why the professor chooses to be both a scholar and a disciple. This is Why Religion. Research to enlighten your mind.
For this first episode of 2023, we are introducing you to a new Why Religion interviewer, one of our recently hired colleagues, Jared Halverson, who is no stranger to religious education and likely no stranger to you, as he is well known and beloved by many. We're grateful that he is now part of BYU Religious Education and part of the Why Religion podcast team. And for his first interview, we have him interviewing one of our regular interviewers, Professor Casey Griffiths, as he turns the tables on the mic on Casey so that we could have him teach and share with us about his recent biography called Truth Seeker: The Life of Joseph F. Merrill. In part one, Dr. Griffiths will talk about why he did this book publication, teaching us about how Joseph Merrill approached truth, his life as the first commissioner of the church educational system, and some of the lessons that he learned about faith and reason, the spiritual and secular, along the way.
Today, I'm grateful for the chance to sit down with a good friend, Casey Paul Griffiths, professor and colleague here at Brigham Young University. You listeners are usually blessed to hear him on this side of the microphone, and this time we'll get to hear from Dr. Griffiths on the other side of the microphone. This is actually the second interview that he's done. The first one, about a year ago, was on a book called 50 Relics of the Restoration. Mm-hmm. And in that one, you dusted off some fascinating physical objects many of which most Latter-day Saints had never heard of. The Green Flake Pioneer Medal, Joseph Smith's Masonic apron, the Los Angeles Temple swimming suit was one of my favorites.
That was one of my favorites too.
But in that book, you were tackling the artifactual, and in this one, the book that we'll discuss today, you're talking about the biographical. But in a similar way, you dusted off someone that I think for too many Latter-day Saints wasn't very well known. So the book that we're going to discuss is called Truth Seeker: The Life of Joseph F. Merrill, Scientist, Educator, and Apostle. And I was amazed as I read this book. You brought someone to life that I needed in my life, and I didn't even know it. And so I'm curious about your experience discovering Elder Merrill and recovering the kinds of legacy that we need as Latter-day Saints in our day. In the very beginning, I think it was the first line of your acknowledgments page, you said, 15 years ago, I had no idea who Joseph F. Merrill was.
That's true, yeah.
And I think many of your readers will say, 15 minutes ago, I didn't know who Joseph Merrill was. What led you to discover him?
Well, I will admit to being totally ignorant about him. In fact, when I was in graduate school, I was asked to give a presentation on the history of the seminary program. And Joseph Merrill is the founding father of seminaries and institutes. And in my presentation, it was such a joke that I didn't know anything that instead of finding a picture of the first seminary, I put up a picture of the Smith family cabin in Palmyra. And it got a big laugh, but it kind of expressed my own ignorance on this subject. So flash forward a couple of years after that, and I'm a master's student in desperate need of a topic for my thesis. And I went to lunch with Scott Esplin, who's now our dean, and Scott just offhandedly mentioned, hey, did you know that Joseph F. Merrill's papers have been donated to BYU? And nobody's ever really explored them. And so, I was in the archive that afternoon and delighted to find that there were 40 boxes of journals and letters and speeches and all kinds of wonderful primary source materials that just were virtually untapped. They were donated to BYU in the early 90s, which was 40 years after Elder Merrill had passed away. And Elder Merrill, it's safe to say, hasn't to this point been a well-known figure in the church.
Right.
And so nobody had really researched it, but what I found in those documents was just a really fascinating story that covered a time period that I was particularly interested in.
What was it about his time period? Because I'm amazed that this early 20th century apostle, he's 22 when the manifesto was given, ending plural marriage in the church. And so to be young and in that courtship dating stage at a time of incredible change in the church, and then his experience as a student, as a university professor, as a professional educator, as well as religious educator, through some incredible moments of church history. And then to be European mission president during the rise of Hitler, remember the Quorum of the 12 during World War II and its aftermath, a fascinating glimpse into some periods of church history and world history.
Yeah.
What was the process like for you? I can only imagine seeing 40 boxes and feeling, you said you were excited. I think I'd feel daunted.
There was nothing to do but just go through page by page everything that was there, and it was a lot of time in the archive, but really, really enjoyable because the period of church history that really fascinates me. I love the early Restoration, and I love modern church history, but there's this period called the transitional period, which is basically that when a person thinks of a Latter-day Saint, they either have two stereotypes in their mind. One is kind of this bearded polygamist, right, that lives in the mountains and hates society and is isolated. And the other is this button-down businessman that's clean-shaven and very sharp and very, on task. And Joseph Merrill spans the transitional period where we go from image number 1 to image number 2. He's born and raised in a home where they practice plural marriage. His dad is Mariner Merrill, who's one of the most well-known apostles of his time period, prominent practitioner of plural marriage. Joseph, on the other hand, ends his life as university professor, buttoned down. I guess he still has a mustache, a beautiful mustache, but he becomes that archetype that Latter-day Saints sort of transform into, a button-down guy who wears a nice suit, who is very serious, very calm, very reserved, And his life covers that whole amazing transition the church goes through, where we're kind of this isolated mountain kingdom in the Intermountain West to this international religion that's spreading throughout the world through a robust missionary system. And the foremost book on this is by Thomas G. Alexander. It's called Mormonism in Transition. It's a fascinating read. He goes through all the changes that happened with the end of plural marriage that basically transformed Latter-day Saints into what they are today. And I thought that Joseph Merrill was a great figure to kind of personalize that. So Tom Alexander's book is brilliant. It covers topic by topic by topic. If you want someone that goes on that journey from being raised in a polygamous household to being sort of a button-down, man-of-the-world, professional, elite, Joseph Merrill really spans that transition and that transformation that happens in the church. And he can sort of speak to both eras about what the blessings of both approaches towards interaction. The church is very isolated when he's a child, and that's by design. Brigham Young wants us to be independent in the West. By the time he dies, the church has moved into the mainstream to a certain extent, and he is conversant in the larger ideas of the world and has connections outside the church. And so it's a great sort of way to capture in one life this transitional period that the church goes through that gets us from where we start to where we are right now.
It's a great way to describe him. And as I read the book, you definitely took me on that journey. And to see in a single life, I loved how you brought up that he's such a bridge builder and trying to reconcile differences between the internal and the external world. Like you're describing, the world of the 19th century church and the world of the 20th century world. What were some stops along that journey that really were pivotal for your understanding?
Yeah, because one of the big themes was these realms that seem irreconcilable. He tries to connect, right? For instance, his dad, Mariner Merrill, very much grows up in kind of this mystical world, visions and angels. And I mean, one of my favorite stories in there is one that most church members might know, but Mariner Merrill is president of the Logan Temple, and he sees a guy standing on the lawn and walks out, and it's Satan. And he has a conversation with Satan where Satan is surrounded by, I guess, evil angels, and basically says, these are my people, and we've come to stop you from, you doing what you're doing in the temple. And Mariner says, no way, man, get out of here. That's not the world that Joseph Merrill inhabits. And it seems like in his writings, he longed to inhabit it. He wanted to have kind of the mystical experiences that his dad has. He wants to go head to head with the devil, but he just doesn't have that experience. That's not how he experiences spirituality. He even talks about how when he was 8, he went through this rite of passage that we all talk about, which is you pray and gain a testimony for yourself that the church is true. But he started praying when he was 8 and got no answer, and continued, according to him, praying until he was 18 every night. Wow. With no response. And then he says it's the night before he's getting ready to go to the University of Deseret. He's going to leave home, and he thinks to himself, well, I might as well go through the motions and pray one more time. I know nothing's going to happen, but I might as well. It's more out of habit at this point than anything else. Then he kneels down and he prays, and he does get the experience. And he describes it as something that was overwhelming, but it's not as mystical as his father, too. It's kind of this physiological. But the funniest thing, he has 2 major spiritual experiences in his life. The second one's on a train where he kind of has this major spiritual epiphany, and he writes up his physiological response and sends it to a scientific conservatory in Boston to basically say, can you explain this?
A true scientific thinker, wasn't he?
Yeah, so he's trying to sort of reconcile the magical world of the early church with the secular world that he lives in. And that, again, is another struggle that sort of has this world of faith and this world of science, where to him, the phrase that he repeats over and over again in his writings is truth where error is found, on Christian or on heathen ground. And so he's totally open to the idea of this more supernatural, more ethereal world, but he's grounded in this material scientific world, and he spends his life trying to get the two worlds to interact, sometimes successfully, but not always.
Well, and that was something I found so fascinating as well. I mean, you mentioned his father having to face down the devil, and yet Joseph talks about having to be caught between the devil and the deep blue sea.
Yeah.
Right, and so this pull toward the spiritual, but also this grounding in the scientific. Walk us through some of his educational experiences. You mentioned in the book that he's one of the very first, if not the first, native Utahn to go back east and get a PhD.
That's the claim, that he is the first native Utahn to get a PhD. And I think that's accurate. He and John A. Widtsoe kind of spend their entire lives competing, and Joseph beats him by a couple months. One interesting thing is his dad, Mariner Merrill, for his kind of mystical, magical background, was very, very enamored with education. He has 8 wives, a huge family, and he tells every single one of the boys and the girls, if you want to get an education, I will pay for it, but you got to be serious about it. And the family produces a number of gifted scholars that really do remarkable work in the church. But that phrase you used, between the devil and the deep blue sea, was actually going to be the title of the book.
Oh, nice.
I had a few marketers say, maybe we should put devil on the title of a book about an apostle. So I chose Truth Seeker. But he uses that phrase to capture what it's like when he goes to college. The way he uses specifically is, he said, I went to the University of Deseret, which later becomes the University of Utah. He spends almost his professional career there. But he says those of us that were part of the church at the university felt like we were between the devil and the deep blue sea, that we weren't secular enough to be accepted by the secular people, but we weren't religious enough to be accepted by the religious people, and we felt like we were caught in this world in between. And that's the story of his life, is him continually negotiating the secular and the spiritual and trying to find the best that are in both and negotiating the two. And for me, I was writing a lot of this when I was in graduate school. I felt like Elder Merrill was my mentor, navigating those challenging. You're learning a lot, but graduate school seems designed to make you sort of a cynical, untrusting person. At the same time, my faith has always been an anchor to me. And I had to figure out, how am I going to swim in these two different ponds and not feel like I'm stuck on the shore between the two. And Merrill was someone that I felt like really successfully navigated those things. Not always, but he never gave up on trying to find a way to make the two work together. He really felt like those two worlds are reconcilable, that you can be a smart person, an educated person, and be a person of faith. And you could be a person of faith and be a smart, educated person. That truth is truth, where it is found, as he said it. That what we're looking for here is truth. And if I find it through a scientific experiment, or I find it through a scriptural passage, it's the same thing. It doesn't really matter. And it seems like one thing that Merrill was really good at was kind of sorting through, well, what does matter? What in the eternal scheme of things is the most important for me to take away from this? So I have people come up and say, what was Elder Merrill's position on evolution? I don't think he really cared that much about it. Honestly, he wasn't a biologist. He studied chemistry and physics, but it seemed like for him, the point was, look at this beautiful, complex, amazing world that we live in. And that was something that strengthened his faith, that when he really did a deep study of how the world worked using the tools of science, it strengthened his testimony and his belief in God as much as a deep and intensive study of the scriptures. In fact, if there's one language it feels like he was more comfortable in, it was the language of science rather than the language of faith. He wasn't a great preacher per se, and most of his general conference talks were filled with statistics and scientific information, and not necessarily kind of the high soaring rhetoric that you would hear from an Orson F. Whitney or a Heber J. Grant. That might be one of the reasons why he's not as well known, as he couldn't turn a phrase quite as well. But at the same time, too, I thought that his approach of saying, hey, if the word of wisdom comes from God, let's examine that scientifically, was really compelling to me as an empiricist myself.
Tell us a little bit more about his role, not just in terms of getting his own education, but in helping other Latter-day Saints get an education, especially a religious education of their own.
My initial study started with just the 5 years he was Church Commissioner of Education, but his name usually first comes up in regards to the seminary program. So he's the founder of the seminary program as we know it, and then he's Church Commissioner of Education when the Institute program is launched. And almost every member of the church has had a brush with seminaries and institutes.
Exactly.
I think you could make a pretty good case the seminaries and institutes are pretty important in the church when it comes to faith formation. The backstory of seminaries and institutes is that Joseph goes east to Johns Hopkins. That's where he spends most of his graduate education, and the University of Michigan. But we have more information about when he was at Johns Hopkins during a time when there was almost no Latter-day Saints in these Eastern universities. So when he's at Johns Hopkins, he's open and saying there was maybe one other person, and I only met him once.
Wow, lonely.
There's no branch for him to attend. There's no missionaries really for him to reach out to, and so he's there by himself. But he's writing a series of letters to his fiancée, Annie Laura Merrill, Hyde Merrill. She's the granddaughter of John Taylor and Orson Hyde. So they're both kind of church royalty, right?
Exactly.
And a lot of these letters highlighted his negotiation where he's sharing some really, really direct opinions about, maybe my parents think I'm apostatizing, but I just think I'm learning how the world works, right? It sounds a lot like what an undergraduate or graduate student would write today. And his fiancée, future wife, is writing back and also sharing some really sharp opinions about women in the priesthood and plural marriage and how she feels about it. And these are conversations that honestly I don't think would be that different if we took an email or a texting thread from a young man and young woman that were in graduate school. He sort of goes less active. I mean, not by choice. There's just nowhere for him to go. But he talks about how when he's in Baltimore studying, he's visiting different churches. He visits a spiritualist seance. And he writes some candid opinions about the leadership of the church. And it seems like during that time, he comes close to maybe thinking, maybe I'll just be a secular person. In fact, that second spiritual experience, the one that he writes up, happens when he's on his way home from his graduate education. And the way he records it just kind of says, I was sitting on a train and I was just thinking about the next course of my life. He's going to come home. He's going to get married. And he's thinking to himself, you know what? I'm not really going to try to stand out. I'm going to go to church, but I'll be one of those back row people that sort
didn't
of
work out for him, did it?
Yeah, that doesn't actively seek to, get a calling but I'll do it. And he opens up the newspaper and he finds out that his friend Richard Lyman has been called as the Sunday school president, and he gets this bolt of lightning feeling like you're going to be called as his counselor. That's the second big spiritual experience of his life. And he took that to mean, okay, I'm wrong. When he gets to the train station, Richard Lyman's there. Richard Lyman tells him, I need you to be my counselor. And it's the embarkation of this life devoted to church service. But it seems like from that point on, he's trying to think, how do I prevent what almost happened to me from happening to any student?
Right.
When the seminary program is launched, we're right at the transition point to where most of the schools in Utah were run by the church academies. But starting in 1890, public high schools start to open, and the year the first seminary program appeared, 1911, demographically, is the year there were more students in public schools than there were in church academies in Utah. And so Merrill lives in downtown Salt Lake in the Granite School District. He knows that his kids are probably going to go to a state high school and not a church academy. Like his wife did. And he sees his wife one night telling stories from the Book of Mormon to his kids. He says, where did you learn all that? She goes, I learned it in James E. Talmage's class at the church academy I attended. And he starts working on, what's a way that we could bring church education, religious education, into a secular environment and setting. One of his daughters said that he was inspired by a Vesper service he attended while he was at the University of Chicago too, that they would, when people were in college, they'd set up these religious services where you could go and hear, a really gifted preacher. And so his idea was, why don't we just take the religion department and build it across the street? And then arrange for the students to be released from school for an hour. They can go across the street, they can receive religious training, and then they can go back. The name seminary outside of our faith generally denotes, training for the ministry. And we would say it's sort of the same thing, right? It's just that everybody's going to be part of the ministry. And he sets up this program that tries to reconcile the two. And later on, he's even more direct when he's setting up the Institute program to Wiley Sessions, who's the first Institute teacher, to say, the reason why we're doing this is to show them how the two worlds can reconcile. That faith and reason are natural companions, that they can belong together. So a kid might take a biology class that causes them to question the truthfulness of the scriptures. I want you not to disavow, not to tell them that what they learned in biology was false. I want you to show them how to negotiate the two worlds. Show them that if you believe this in biology, it doesn't have to destroy your testimony of the scriptures. There's a way to reconcile the two and bring them together. And to that extent, another interesting thing is that the educators he chose, Wiley Sessions and the first seminary teacher was a guy named Thomas Yates, were both very well-educated people too. I mean, Thomas Yates, the first seminary teacher, was a Cornell graduate. And he wasn't an educator by profession. He was an engineer working on the Murray power plant. Talks about how he'd work on the power plant, and then in the afternoon he'd hop on his horse and he'd ride to the Granite Seminary building and he'd teach a class. And he's only able to do this for a year, but it just goes to speak that he seeks out the smartest person that he can find. And I don't know about Yates's charisma or anything like that, but Joseph wanted to apply intellect to faith. He thinks to himself, what makes a good teacher? Someone that's really educated. And it doesn't seem like he has the same fears about education destroying faith that many of his contemporaries have.
What kinds of aspects of his experience as an educator, as a student, as well as a teacher, do you find most relevant to a modern Latter-day Saint?
Just first of all, to not panic when it comes to learning new knowledge. Joseph Merrill is head of the church educational system at a time when the conflict between science and religion are at their peak. Like the key incident is the Scopes monkey trial, right? Which most people are aware of. A science teacher in Tennessee refuses to teach state curriculum because he wants to teach evolution. And it turns into this media circus where two of the most famous names, Clarence Darrow, who's this liberal lawyer, and William Jennings Bryan, who's this conservative champion, he's run for president several times, basically don't even really care about the biology teacher. What they want to do is, in a courtroom, put the Bible and the theory of evolution on trial against each other. Now, one of the interesting things in the background is that this drama, which is playing out between conservative Christians and more liberal thinkers, is in the background. Here's the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. In the 1920s, when this so-called conflict is at its height, scientists are being called into the Quorum of the 12. You got John A. Widtsoe, who's an agronomist. You got James E. Talmage, who's a geologist. You got Richard Lyman, who is a chemist. You got Joseph Merrill, who's a physicist. And though we did have our own little versions of conflict, I know that Joseph Fielding Smith and James E. Talmage got into it a couple times, but it seems like the leadership of the church didn't see a degree in science as an automatic disqualifier for them to be a great leader of faith. In fact, during that time, one of the statistics that's quoted in LeGrand Richards' book is that Utah produces per capita more scientists than any other state in the union. And it's at a time when we're also very, very religious. And it seems like we just had this better, more healthier, more holistic approach. I'm trying to think about it. Maybe it happens because Joseph Smith is post-Enlightenment. And so there's a lot of stuff in the Doctrine and Covenants that deals with scientific concepts. Immaterial matter are words that pop up in there, right? Or things that post-Enlightenment we'd be discussing. But it just seemed like we were better equipped to deal with the scientific revolution than a lot of other Christian faiths were. And men and women like Joseph F. Merrill really kind of expressed this idea that the conflict between science and religion is a false dichotomy, that they're both equal methods of seeking truth. They might appear to be in conflict, at least temporarily, but there's usually a way to reconcile things if you spend enough time and think slowly and think deeply about how things work. And so, I mean, one lesson I've learned is don't panic. If you learn something new that you feel like contradicts your worldview, don't automatically abandon your worldview. Don't chase every wind of doctrine that comes along. But it's okay to sit there and say, I hadn't considered that before. I didn't know about that. I'm going to take time and think deeply about what this means and if there's a way to reconcile my faith with it. I had a student come up to me the other day and say, hey, is it okay if I can't quite reconcile this right now? I'm like, totally fine. It's
Great
okay
advice.
for you to take time and allow your faith and your reason to naturally grow together on this particular subject. It's when either side, whether it's the faith side or the reason side, pushes us to just abandon a concept because it appears to conflict, that we get into trouble and we start bouncing from place to place. And then it causes us to sort of lose faith in any kind of foundational truth, to where we just become cynical and, don't have much of faith in anything.
Rather than do a typical commercial break for something from BYU's Religious Studies Center, I wanted to take a moment to thank you for listening and sharing and being part of the Why Religion podcast. If you can believe it, this is the start of our 4th season together. Because of each of you, the podcast continues to grow in reach and impact as we seek to bring the wonderful research publications and insights from BYU religion faculty to the broader church community and public. We are really excited for the upcoming 2023 season. We've got great episodes already recorded or lined up, covering a broad range of really interesting topics, such as how do you transmit faith to the rising generation, the law of consecration, how we think about church doctrine, early temple worship, Royal Skousen and the Book of Mormon Text Project, and even a publication on the history of Latter-day Saints in Las Vegas. Yes, an episode on Vegas, baby. I hope you are as excited about Season 4 as I am, and we'll share that excitement with others by recommending the podcast to them and leaving us a great rating to help in the recommending algorithms. We look forward to another year with you as we seek to bring into one general place some of the great and recent publications from BYU religion professors to help enlighten and inspire the everyday seeker of truth. We think Joseph Merrill would approve. Okay, we've been listening to Jared Halverson interview his religious education and Why Religion colleague Casey Griffiths on his publication on the life and influence of Joseph F. Merrill. In part 2 of Why Religion, we like to explore a little bit more why this research matters. How can it inform and help us in living, learning, or loving aspects of the restored gospel of Jesus Christ? In this part 2, Professor Griffiths picks up where we left off on the discussion on Joseph Merrill and learning from him about balancing faith and reason, the spiritual and secular, the scientific and doctrinal, the mind and the heart.
I think a lot of our listeners and a lot of members of the church are probably wrestling with those kinds of issues. And to be able to have a mentor, as you said earlier, in Joseph F. Merrill, to be able to help them navigate that. It wasn't always an easy process, though, for him, wasn't it? Especially when he presided over the church educational system and saw the growth of the Institute program particularly, and the Chicago experiment and some challenges there. Is there anything there you want to speak to?
Yeah. What's been known as the Chicago experiment is probably the most famous thing that's come out of this book, and famous, relatively speaking, like 3 or 4 people know about this besides me. But Joseph Merrill, once the Institute program is set up, realizes we need people that can train seminary and institute teachers, and so he recruits a number of teachers to go to the University of Chicago. Big names: Sidney Sperry, Heber Snell, a bunch of people that are going to be largely influential in education throughout the rest of the 20th century. Now, the University of Chicago is probably the most liberal theological school in America, too. But they send them there for a couple of reasons. Sperry, for instance, becomes really enamored with the University of Chicago, and Merrill just trusts him. Secondly, they invite a guy named Edgar Goodspeed, who is one of the most well-known biblical scholars of his day, to come to BYU and teach the seminary and institute teachers, and they are blown away by what they hear. They love this guy. Like, people just sing his praises up and down. And the last reason is this is a time when there's still a lot of animosity towards Latter-day Saints. I don't think any theology school in the country besides Chicago would have accepted Latter-day Saints into their ranks. So these scholars get recruited to go there, and some of them have real issues with what they hear. T. Edgar Lyons, another really famous name. And he writes back and basically says, the problem here is that they've reduced the gospel to a system of ethics. They don't believe in miracles. They don't believe in any kind of supernatural power in the gospel. It's just an ethical way to live your life. And he feels like that has no power. There's other people like Russell Swenson, who also becomes really gifted BYU, that just becomes enamored with their system, just loves it, totally embraces it. And then there are the median of the road, like Sidney Sperry, who Sidney Sperry is writing letters home from Chicago saying, I learned a lot about biblical exegesis and eisegesis, archaeology for the Old Testament. I can't wait to apply this stuff to the book of Abraham, and see how that works. Like, he's just excited to take these tools out for a test drive with restoration scripture and see how it's going to work. And that little incident plays out over the canvas of church education for the next 30 years, where these guys come back from Chicago, and sometimes, like Sperry, their ideas are really embraced, and they really take us to the next level. Some of Sperry's arguments to defend restoration scripture are still in circulation today. And then there's other people that come back and become so secular that they start to push against our system as well, because the real question they're trying to resolve is in a faith where almost every member of the priesthood is a lay member of the priesthood. Can you have professional religionists? So what does a guy like Sidney Sperry do when the head of the church is Heber J. Grant, who's a businessman? I mean, you could probably objectively say that Sidney Sperry knows more about the scriptures than Heber J. Grant does, but Heber J. Grant has the calling as a prophet of God. In the late 1930s, there started to be these conflicts over, well, who should be the authority when it comes down to it? And that leads to the charted course of the church in education, which most church educators are familiar with. But the context is that these Chicago teachers, especially Heber Snell, have come back and they've started to make waves. Heber Snell gives a big speech where he basically says, I don't think the book of Jonah and a lot of the things in the Old Testament should be taken literally. And we could have a whole debate about that, right? Back and forth. But it seems like the first presidency became alarmed that we may have been tipping to the other side of the scale and becoming too secular. So J. Reuben Clark gives this speech where he outlines the course of the church in education, and it seems like some of his speech is a pointed reference to some of these scholars, where he says, you may have gone away and gotten the most up-to-date training. That doesn't give you the same authority as a person that's called by revelation. And I will say that I feel like there were bumps along the road, but Latter-day Saints have navigated that tension between the two surprisingly well, where we've got a nice mixture among the leadership of the church of people that are religion scholars. I think you could put Elder Holland up against any other religion scholar in another church. But we've also got people that kind of have more practical know-how and people skills and savvy than a religion scholar would typically have. So we've got this wonderful mixture of someone like Elder Holland that can, expound the scriptures all the day long. And then someone like Gordon B. Hinckley, who has a real people and business savvy that knows how to manage a large organization well. If I'm being totally honest, I don't know if guys like me and you should run the church. I mean, I don't think poorly of myself, but I also know that I'm an academic, and that means that I don't always have the practical know-how and skills to run the church as efficiently as it is run. And it's really great to look at our leadership and say there's a mixture of the practical, down to earth, this is how we've got to get things done, and also the lyrical, this is why what we're doing is beautiful and wonderful and why it changes people's lives. And that unique mixture, I think, has really been powerful for the church. I think Joseph Merrill would land on the side of someone who never became a great religious scholar. When I read through his letters, his answers when it came to the scriptures were usually fairly simplistic, and he was pretty open to say, I'm going to go talk to somebody that has more expertise than I. He'd call Sidney Sperry or something like that. But he had also this wonderful practical approach. He'd run a physics department and been, the assistant head of a university, and so he had great managerial skills. His lack of maybe grandeur when it comes to expounding the gospel might mean that he's less quoted today, but we don't always appreciate how important a good manager that knows how to set people up and put good people in the right place and let them do their thing is important. So even though he gets quoted a lot less than a contemporary like James E. Talmage, or John A. Widtsoe, Joseph Merrill plays a really important role in erecting some of the structural things like the church educational system that have given us a lot of benefits in perpetuating our faith and allowing young people to articulate their faith in a great way. One of the guys that goes to Chicago, one of the Chicago scholars, George Tanner, who kind of, he stays in the church, but he's kind of on the, edgier side of things. He's interviewed and he says Joseph F. Merrill just had so much faith in the gospel that he didn't think going to Chicago would hurt us at all. I mean, Joseph F. Merrill isn't an expert in the biblical studies of his day, but he was like, the gospel's true, so what do we have to worry about, really? And there are genuinely things to worry about becoming too secular in our approach to religion and the scriptures and taking away the miraculous side of things that we believe in. But at the same time, too, I sometimes worry that we don't always do the best job creating a sense of curiosity in Latter-day Saints around us, to where we can say, hey, we can poke our head into this conversation and be part of it. Or there's a cool space telescope up there. This is why this doesn't hurt our faith. In fact, this is amazing to learn, and that we should be as excited about garnering all forms of knowledge as we sometimes get about religious forms of knowledge. I mean, honestly, when I read an article about the Webb telescope, it's really edifying for me to see the wonders and glory and grandeur of the universe. It strengthens my faith in God as much as it does when I read the scriptures, and I love the scriptures too. And I think in the Book of Mormon in particular, when Alma's arguing that God exists to Korihor, he says, you've got the scriptures and the testimony of these our brethren, and all the planets which do move in their regular form do witness that there's a divine creator. In other words, Alma's saying the scriptures, the prophets, and then look around you. Everything around us testifies. It screams out that there's a divine creator and a plan for us. And Joseph Merrill's writings were almost as much in conversation with these secular scholars. Like in the book I took the title from, the only book he really wrote was called The Truth Seeker and Mormonism. And the chapter headings in there are things like nature is kind to man. This comes directly from an interview Thomas Edison gave. Thomas Edison's an atheist. And when someone asks him why he's an atheist, his one-word answer is, it doesn't seem like nature is kind to man. It doesn't seem like the universe is calculated to keep us alive. It seems like the universe is trying to kill us. Joseph Merrill writes an entire chapter to basically say, nature is kind to man. Let me explain to you how perfect everything is, and how if we were 1 degree this way or that way, this whole thing might not have come together to begin with. And so it seems like a lot of his work was in conversation with these bright secular thinkers outside the church, to him just basically saying, yeah, faith is relevant in the world. Science can teach us how, when, and what, and where, but it can't answer one of the big questions, which is why. And for that, you have to turn to religion and philosophy. And so rather than dismissing one or the other, religion tries to strangle science in the cradle, and science tries to dismiss religion as being outdated and not useful. We look at both to say we need both to answer these questions that we ache to know the answer to know how big the universe is, but to know what the universe means and how it relates to me is a major gift that religion can offer the world and makes it still relevant in today's world.
Well, all the more reason to make the life of Joseph F. Merrill relevant to us. And you've done an incredible job of that. Do you think there's anything else that he would give by way of counsel to any Latter-day Saint that is wrestling with issues that he had to wrestle with, or that the church in general had to wrestle with through his time period?
One thing that stands out in the book is probably the most ancient of divides, which is men and women. One of the things that I was genuinely delighted in my studies to find was a number of prominent women in his life that he really encouraged to be educated and saw as equals, and loved. There's three key women, and this ties into science and religion too. There's his wife Laura Merrill, who again is co-founder of the seminary. She's the one that inspires him. She's so educated in the scriptures. He says we got to get a way to make more people like her.
Well, and she helped ground him during his studies.
Yeah, during his studies.
She was
during his
amazing.
studies. They're going back and forth having these tense and conversations about women in the priesthood and the role of women. And I mean, on their honeymoon, she gives a scientific lecture. She's the head of the Daughters of the Utah Pioneers. She's just delightful. She dies of cancer relatively young. And this is where science and religion comes in. I found some poignant points in his journal where he said, if I had just understood the nature of nutrition and the word of wisdom, I think I could have saved her.
Wow.
So he's trying to, bring together faith and science in a way that saves her, but he loses her. Then his second wife, Millie, is a convert to the church. I was surprised to find she got baptized, 3 days before they got married. She's the polar opposite of Laura, who's, the granddaughter of two apostles, one president of the church. She knows practically nothing about the church. She's really stubborn. And yet she's the one that goes on his mission with him, that he becomes really, really close to, and their relationship grows together. She's the mother to most of his children. One day he loses her, just comes home and she's gone. The last one is his daughter, Laura, named after his wife, who in the final days of his life gets cancer, just like her mother. And now he's like, this is my chance. This is my chance to employ the true principles of science and the word of wisdom and save my daughter. And there's this poignant thread in his journal where he just watches her waste away and realizes there's not much he can do. In fact, one of his granddaughters, who's still alive, was living with them at the time Laura was dying. And she shared a pencil sketch she drew of him. And there's just this worn expression on his face where he's tired and worried. And it seems like at the end of his life, maybe the last great lesson he had to learn was, I can't solve everything. That he was a truth seeker who sought solutions and sometimes beat himself up when he didn't find the solutions in time. But maybe the last lesson he had to learn was to kind of let go and realize that some things are beyond your control, that there are some mysteries that faith and science can't answer, that you just kind of have to walk into the darkness and expect a light to be there next along the way. So it's a beautiful story, and I was genuinely impressed at how at a time when in the early 20th century, one of the things the church was doing was becoming more conservative in its approach towards women, right? We were trying to fit into the mainstream. And so some of these things that were introduced in Nauvoo that were somewhat radical were pulled back. Joseph F. Merrill seemed to be all in on women and their role within the church and their role as educators and scholars and teachers, and made sure that just like his father did, all of his children, the male and the female children, received education and played prominent roles in society. So, I think he tried to bridge the gap between the sexes as well, and saw these remarkable women in his life as partners in creating things and not rivals that he had to overwhelm.
If you're interested in reading this great biography by Dr. Casey Griffiths called Truth Seeker, The Life of Joseph F. Merrill, Scientist, Educator, and Apostle, we've included a link to it on our website at whyreligion.byu.edu. Okay, we've arrived at our last segment, part 3, where we like to discuss things a little bit more personally with a professor. Since you're very familiar with Professor Griffiths from his previous interviews and also his other Why Religion episode, number 44, on 50 relics of the Restoration, in this part, Professor Griffiths talks personally about why he sustains church leaders while seeing their humanity or imperfections as they serve the Lord in this divine work. Also sharing his personal gratitude for Joseph F. Merrill and people like him for their influence in seeking and following truth.
In your study, as you are trying to make sense of a historical figure, an apostle of the Lord Jesus Christ, and the closer you get to someone, the more human they seem to become, right? To the point of no man is prophet in his own country. Well, you became a member of the country of Joseph F. Merrill in your studies. And often that tends to diminish our view of someone because we see their humanity when all we've known before is the divinity of their calling. From a personal side, how did you navigate your study of Joseph F. Merrill and balance that divinity and humanity within him?
He was flawed. He struggled in a lot of ways. It seems like I interviewed a lot of his kids, and a lot of people said he was really socially awkward. He was the quiet guy sitting in the corner, not trying to be the center of attention or stir things up. That made me love him more and more deeply. He struggled in his second marriage. There's a place where he must have had a bad fight with Millie, and he writes about how much he misses his first wife and how hard it was to lose her and how difficult it was to be at a place in his life that he didn't think he was going to be. Now, he does learn to love Millie, and Millie learns to love him, and they're very close. But it made me realize, you know what? I have a wonderful wife, but we have days where we struggle. And seeing him write about how much he missed his first wife and how much he wished he had not taken her for granted kind of made me, I remember reading this in the special collections reading room and thinking, I need to go home and tell my wife how valuable she is and how much to love her. It's almost like he spoke off the page and said to me, you're not always going to have her around. And so you need to make sure that she's cherished while she's here, because he felt the real pain and loss of losing this person who was his special partner in his life. Now, again, he loves his second wife and they have a great relationship too, but that poignancy really touched me. And the other thing too was one of the most shocking incidents that came out was his friendship with Richard Lyman. Richard Lyman, if he's known today among the church, is known for being the last apostle excommunicated from the church. And I ran across this. I knew Richard Lyman had been excommunicated, but I just didn't know what the depth of their friendship was, that they went to the University of Michigan together. Richard Lyman calls him into church activity. They share offices at the University of Utah. They walk to church headquarters together when they get made apostles. And then one day, Joseph Merrill comes in and sit down, the Quorum of the 12's meeting. Richard Lyman has done something really serious. And an hour later, Richard Lyman's excommunicated. And that would be so devastating. But when I read through Joseph's journal, I started to notice this pattern. It was Richard Lyman came to my house for dinner. Richard Lyman and I went to a football game together. Richard Lyman and I went for a drive. Richard Lyman and I spent a couple hours talking through his situation. And he didn't give up on the people in his life. Like, he's not the broad, grand gesture, I'm going to bring you back into the church. It was this quiet, come over and have dinner with me. Or let's have a conversation, or let's go to a football game. Richard Lyman stays with his wife, Amy Brown Lyman, who's remarkable in her own right, and is rebaptized into the church in 1953, I believe, after Joseph passes away. But it was those quiet connections, those little tiny things that he did, those not splashy but quiet acts of service and love and devotion that came out as well. To say, you think a person that has the title apostle is going to be a big, broad, charismatic figure. I don't know if he was, but he was steady and consistent and genuine in his relationships with people. And that over a long period of time created this really, really beautiful connection of friendships and families that I want to build in my life too, that I learned a little bit about how to do that from him.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much, Casey. If I could just ask you one last question. If it were Joseph F. Merrill sitting here instead of me, and you were talking to him, anything you'd want to say by way of gratitude to this mentor that you had through your graduate years, a mentor that you've given to another generation of readers? As one of those, I'm grateful now to have a mentor as I try to navigate faith and doubt and secularism and spirituality. Anything you'd want to say to him by way of his influence on your testimony of the Savior and the restoration?
I haven't had a chance to sit down with Elder Merrill, and I'm looking forward to it. I think the next best thing was I've had a chance to sit down with a number of his grandchildren. This book has been a labor of love in the sense that they've been there and they've encouraged me, and they bought a couple boxes of the book too, which made me really happy personally, because this is sort of an off the off the beaten path subject. I'd say to him the same thing I've said to them. I would say, I don't think I could have had a better mentor through my education than you. And I know that he's been in the spirit world for, almost 70 years now. But I'm grateful that he left behind this documentary record. And I can say that I've felt his gentle hand guiding me as I navigated the same road that he went down, this really treacherous faith and reason, and helped find a middle way. And I sincerely hope, that at the end of my life, someone can say about me what I can say about him, that he was a fearless seeker of truth, no matter where it was found. He just had no fear when it came to delving into religious or scientific truth. But secondly, that he shared what he knew with other people and seemed to be focused on the type of truth that makes a genuine difference in people's lives, that makes the world a better place, whether that's creating an incandescent light bulb or whether that's helping a person know and understand that they're truly a child of God and that they have a divine destiny and purpose. So, just overwhelming gratitude to have this wonderful apostle guide me through this tentative period of my life when I was going through my graduate education.
Thank you for listening to Why Religion. This podcast is a production of Religious Education at Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah. My name is Anthony Sweat, the host and producer. The Why Religion podcast team also includes from BYU Religious Education Professors Brad Wilcox, Casey Griffiths, Ryan Sharp, and Hank Smith. Recording, mixing, and original music was done by BYU student Mitchell Bashford. Say hi, Mitchell.
Hey, guys.
Original music and scoring for Why Religion podcast was also created by the fabulous BYU student musicians Grant Cagle,
Sam Clausen,
Colette Jones,
and
Alistair Scheuermann.
If you enjoy what you've heard, please like and subscribe to Why Religion on wherever you get your podcasts and leave us a rating. It really helps. And join us next time as we continue to bring the everyday Latter-day Saint fascinating gospel studies done by Brigham Young University religion professors to enlighten your mind and strengthen your faith.